Okay, so what I want to talk about today are just some ideas that have been bouncing around my head for a bit now. And it really started a while ago when Rob Kitchen invited me to Maynooth to talk about data and data appropriation strategies of civil society organizations. And I sort of went down that rabbit hole for a little bit, and then I got distracted by this project, which is essentially a book that I've just completed that will be out in October this year with Bristol University Press. And in it, I essentially consolidate a lot of the work that I have been doing on smart cities, which is essentially a super critical perspective on what is smart and what is a city and what happens when you kind of bring the two concepts together. But in terms of specifics, what I'm really interested in is to really challenge the notion of the African smart city, problematize it, conceptualize it, and explores what smart urbanism and African urban spaces really are like. How do they function, and with a particular emphasis on platforms. So I think a large part of what I do is essentially sort of try and figure out, what's the imagination that drives this kind of imagery, and how does that, what are the tensions that surface and the contradictions that surface when you sort of compare the rendered smart city idea, when you can, that's supposedly eco-Atlantic in Lagos, when you compare it with what the real city looks like, and that's Sierra Leone's Freetown, that's Johannesburg in South Africa. And I guess as a spatial planner and as someone who's interested in places, this has always been something that's really driven my work, is this kind of these contradictions. And then also just kind of engaging what technology appropriation looks like in African urban spaces, whether it is Freetown or Nairobi or Kampala. And I mean, what I've found over the years is obviously the kind of predominance of the smartphone as a kind of infrastructure on the body, that often kind of constitutes as part of what constitutes a kind of urbanism on the go, reinvention, constant reinventions at the margins. And just the ways through which smart infrastructures interact with analog, I guess, infrastructures and with the day-to-day livelihoods of people, and what that might mean for how we think about cities. So, so Edgar Peterson put this up at a talk that we were both at the other day, which I just loved. And it was literally the day after the Oscars. And I mean, there is this tendency to, not to condone public violence, but there is this tendency to kind of throw the smart city idea around as a kind of solution to all sorts of intractable problems, without actually being terribly specific about what that means, without being terribly specific about the problem it's trying to solve. And as a kind of urbanist, I find this incredibly challenging to kind of get my head around, because it's quite a dominant narrative, and it's a narrative that has found its way into policy circles. I mean, the whole of Kigali is being redesigned as a smart city, and it's led to the kind of building of satellite cities on the outskirts of Nairobi, on the outskirts of Accra. So, I mean, there's a spatial implication that has kind of led to a kind of extreme form of splintering urbanism in many parts of the continent. So I take issue with it. I take issue with it as an urban planner. But I think what's really interesting is to understand what the African city looks like, because by understanding what the African city looks like, I think we can kind of get an idea of what a true African smart city could be, or indeed should perhaps be. So in doing this work, I sort of draw on three sort of bodies of literature, and the one is a literature that's very close to home, and it's a literature that is very much anchored at this African Centre for Cities in Cape Town, with people like Edgar Peterson, Abdul Malik Simone, who's a fellow there, etc., but also people like Jenny Robinson and Anya Roy. And the folks who are willing to at least investigate the embedded kind of qualities of African urbanism and that kind of take a stance that African cities aren't necessarily just incomplete versions of their northern counterparts. They're not failures. They're not, they essentially kind of, they may even kind of show us ways through which urbanity is being redefined in very interesting ways, where there are large sort of cleavages between the haves and the have-nots, and where there's infrastructure failure. Simone and Peter should talk about sort of dissonance, or kind of, I guess, unsettling binaries between the formal and the informal, the public and the private. Where, you know, what kind of defines urbanity is a kind of messiness, but it's not just a kind of ad hoc messiness. There's a kind of certain rhythms to the way that the informal economy works, for example, and its connections into the formal economy, as an example of what's quite predominant in African cities, and that is informality. And it's something I engage with continuously in the book, because you cannot not engage with it. It's informal urbanization is pretty much what defines city growth in these places, in these regions. And then Ananya and others talk about sort of different modes and models of worlding that Jenny Robertson writes about as well. And really just the last phrase, you know, understanding the African city does require an engagement with the substantive qualities of its spaces, the trends, the numbers, the understandings about infrastructural backlogs, etc., livelihoods. But it also needs a kind of recognition for the kind of on-the-go problem solving and livelihood strategies that define just how things function sort of under the surface. And then there's a literature on infrastructure studies that's increasingly engaging, and it's in political ecology where it's becoming quite interesting, with people like John Silver, Hendrik Eriksson, and Mary Lahan, and it really sort of starts looking at the sort of heterogeneity of kind of human and non-human networks, I guess taking a very relational, almost like an actor network theory approach to the ways through which infrastructures are essentially reinvented at the margins. And in fact, John writes about sustainable transitions in African cities as a kind of result of kind of bottom-up strategies. And then there's also, Simone coined the phrase people as infrastructure, which kind of gets banded out about it quite a lot. But I guess from a substantive perspective, there's a lot of infrastructure investment in African cities, but often quite misguided, often sort of white elephants, often sort of not where it's needed most, and often these things constrain mobility and livelihoods. So back to the book. Essentially what I then do in the book is I look at 4 themes that I feel encapsulate sort of a large part of how we might think about African urban futures. And then within those themes, I investigate various kind of vignettes of technology appropriation that I feel could sort of start, sort of turning the tanker into a different direction with regards to these themes. And the one is mobility, and then there's food security, social mobilization, and public culture, where I get kind of trippy around sort of Afrofuturism and so forth. I know it's such fun. But I'm not going to talk about Afrofuturism. What I am going to talk about, and I'm not going to talk about these guys either. I sort of looked at a border ride-hailing app in Kampala that was started by Ugandans. I looked at a kind of food supply chain app in Nairobi. And then I looked at Map Kibera, which I've written about before, and other places where I sort of look at on and offline sort of map-driven strategies to social mobilization strategies. I mean, the conclusions to the book essentially sort of come up with a number of themes, or I guess almost like leitmotifs, really, that essentially say, well, it's about flow and connection, it's about governance and new regimes, trust and continuity, and then I sort of reflect on what I'd rather refer to as hybrid urbanism rather than smart urbanism, as kind of these kind of collective assemblages of on and offline strategies used in terms of livelihoods. But it's social mobilization that I want to talk about now, And this idea, excuse me, excuse me, this idea of cyborg activism that I'm sort of playing with, and really what I'm doing is I'm the chapter to come. Yes, I'm one of those two. It's basically kind of taking the ideas from this one chapter in the book and then kind of developing them further and theorizing further based on kind of social mobilization strategies. So here I was, so just around about the time that the Sustainable Development Goals were being formulated, and like many folks who work in urban studies in the Global South, I got invited to write about it a little bit. But basically we were sort of trying to get a handle on what this could mean, the Sustainable Development Goals, could it really make a difference? And the one paper that I absolutely love was by Maria Kaika, published in Environment and Urbanization, which is it was such a great journal because it's so low-key and yet it's so influential. And I heard her speak to this as well at the Beyond Smart Cities conference in Rotterdam, where she says, well, you know, I mean, aren't we just making the same mistakes again, where we're formulating these quantifiable indicators that we kind of monitor on an ongoing basis, and we congratulate ourselves with a little bit of progress we make every year? Is it really getting to the crux of the problems that we supposedly should be solving? And she basically says, you know, surely we've learned to be more savvy, to be more knowledgeable. And she talks about, oh, I wasn't going to take you there just yet. She talks about a politics of dissensus. And here I really connect with your work, Alison. You know, about let's find those messy, rather glitchy kind of instances of unhappiness. and let's try and understand what that means. Let's see what that teaches us about the city, what that might tell us about the city. So I'm going to take you to a city. I'm going to take you to my hometown, Cape Town. And that's not the Cape Town we're going to go to, although I can show you where I live, just over there somewhere. But I'm going to take you to this Cape Town. So Johnny Miller is a drone photographer, photojournalist, who takes these incredible images using drone photography, obviously, unless you're hanging out of a plane, where he sort of he captures inequality. And this is quite a famous picture of his of Cape Town. And of course, you know, we have this rather unenviable sort of status of being the most unequal country in the world. The Gini coefficient is I can't remember what it was at last count, but it's pretty, it doesn't reflect well on our country, let me just say that. But what he does say here, and this is what I really want to draw attention to, it's not his work I'm going to talk about, but the thing that I do want to just set the scene with, is he talks about how what the drone photography shows is the very scale and the regularity of these kind of these big contradictions, spatial contradictions. And he talks about this is not organic, this is planned, and this is intentional. And in a way, it's a reflection of apartheid planning and the way that apartheid planning has persisted in reinforcing spatial inequality. But it's also reflective of other forces, such as obviously land markets and property markets, etc. I mean, Cape Town's a very desirable city, especially as a second home for many people, and it's had a huge impact on property markets, and it's definitely kind of added to a lot of the inequality in the city that has persisted and indeed grown. So out of this, I looked at a number of social movements and or civil society organizations, and one of them is Indefuna Ukwazi, which is a local social movement that I first came across a number of years ago when they started a campaign called Reclaim the City. And essentially what Reclaim the City was about, it came about because of the sale of a public school about half a kilometer from where I live. And the legislation requires the government to advertise that sale because it's a public good. And essentially what the city of Cape Town was doing, the Western Cape government, which is our provincial government, was doing it, was selling the property to a private school company, of which there are many. You know, privatization of education is obviously a trend worldwide. And a number of folks got together and said, this is unacceptable. This is perfect land for social housing, for inclusionary housing. It's on a number of good transport networks. It's in a mixed-use area. I mean, there's a whole bunch of planning reasons, and they got together and they essentially stopped the sale of the land. They essentially stopped it through social action. I mean, personal disclaimer, in a way, I was the sort of expert witness for the court case, so I'm sort of part of the gang. But what I found particularly interesting about the Reclaim the City campaign is the way that it used digital media in its activity. And the way that it used a number of kind of techniques to sort of push the agenda that they were essentially kind of engaging in. Actually, let me just go back. So, I mean, this essentially entailed, well, first of all, it entailed kind of traditional sort of protest marches, etc., and then a Twitter campaign and a social media campaign using Facebook. But then it became kind of a little bit more textured and a little bit more granular, you know, sort of whilst the court case was ongoing, this would be captured with, using Twitter. The tweets would then be WhatsApp to particular journalists and particular interest groups. And I mean, it all sounds quite straightforward, but what I found fascinating was the content. I mean, I did essentially, I guess what you could call digital ethnography of the kind of the Twitter account over a couple of months. And what I found was the storytelling aspect, which was quite compelling. And this kind of framing through the kind of choice of tweets and through the kind of choice of hashtags of the villains and the heroes. And then the heroes were the folks who were kind of constantly their stories being told about the conditions that homeless people live in, or the conditions that people in gentrified areas live in, the kind of choices that they have to make on a daily basis, and then kind of contrasting that with the kind of policy choices that were being made in almost an abstract. So, I mean, that was kind of the first time I encountered Ndufuna Ukwazi, and then more recently I did some interviews for the purposes of the book with some of their organizers. And it's become quite a big team, and it's become a very sophisticated team that uses, again, a smorgasbord of techniques and strategies to involve and influence the public. So I mean, kind of ranging from, I mean, you'll see that tactic, be flexible. I mean, there's quite a lot of blogs and Medium articles about Ndufuna Ukwazi internationally. But basically, yeah, sort of organizing public events, organizing online events. A lot of it is becoming educational, how to kind of educate people on what their rights are with regards to accessing public funding for housing. South Africa has quite an extensive public housing program, but it's confusing and it's difficult to get onto waiting lists, and we have something called gap housing, which is where you fall between the gap of you're not able to get a mortgage, but you're not able to get a housing subsidy either. So, you know, which is kind of a big problem in Cape Town, particularly, especially with the property market the way it is. But what I found quite fascinating was their use of Instagram, and again, this very interesting kind of narrative being built up over frame by frame by frame. And essentially what this campaign is about, and my late colleague Vanessa Watson worked with them on it, is kind of saying, okay, so there's publicly owned land within the metropolitan area of Cape Town. If we look at this land, we could most likely house about, you know, kind of about 20,000 families, and then sort of gradually working through the technical argument very visually, and then having associated kind of events around that. So again, this kind of this combination of on and offline strategies to educate, to enroll, and to publicize. So that's the one example I looked at. And then the other example I looked at was something that emerged during the lockdown, which is called Cape Town Together. Well, the umbrella idea is called Cape Town Together, and I intentionally use the word idea. Basically the forming of community action networks. So the lockdown, so the South African government was super decisive with regard to its approach to COVID. I mean, our president kind of got up and said, we're acting quickly. We don't want our health services to be overextended, etc. It's the whole story. South African government got praised for its decisive action. But the big mistake it made, and you can't really blame them for it, is they took a one-size-fits-all approach in a country where your settlement typologies range from deeply rural to peri-urban, often traditional land, to informal settlements in urban areas, and then to kind of your more salubrious neighborhoods. And essentially what they did is they prohibited people from trading on streets. They prohibited, obviously, they minimized social interaction. And what it led was to a massive food crisis. I mean, essentially what you have is a lot of people in informal settlements and in former township areas rely heavily on food vendors for buying groceries and food. And it's got largely to do with the fact that you can buy small amounts, you can pay cash, you can have a credit sort of arrangement. It's kind of ingrained in kind of day-to-day livelihood strategies. So that was what part of the fallout, and part of the fallout was just people losing their jobs and not being able to work. And it was really quite horrific, the impact that the lockdown had. So what happened in Cape Town is a whole bunch of people got together and formed something called Cape Town Together, and they came up with a manifesto and called it Ways of Working, and it's essentially a manifesto of values around forming what is called community action networks. And these are neighborhood-based networks organized on WhatsApp, nothing glamorous. Some of them have websites, some of them have Facebook sites. And each can, they're called cans, great play of words, obviously. And each can has a different character, has a different way of organizing, has a different kind of modus operandi, but essentially each can then is responsible for kind of ensuring that people don't suffer, that each can kind of takes that on. And then you started getting partnerships across cans where your more sort of wealthier neighborhoods were partnering together with your less wealthy neighborhoods and sort of forming these kind of alliances and so forth. So it's essentially, again, quite a low-tech sort of solution to quite an intricate problem. And it had huge implications. I think something like 40,000 food parcels were distributed in 1 week through the cans. I mean, it had real impacts, and sort of had impacts that kind of lasted as well. So this is the Muizenberg Can, which is in the South Peninsula area. And one of the principles that informs the cans is when I did the interviews around this for the book, where the person one of the pioneers said, you know what it is? It's not about addressing goals. It's not about problem solving either. It's about moving at the speed of trust. It's about actually getting together and understanding what the local problem is, what the neighborhood problem is, and actually just starting to trust each other, starting to build alliances, and doing this slowly but surely. I sort of tried to get an understanding of, so where's the digital in all of this? I mean, basically it's a bunch of people talk to each other, form WhatsApp groups. I was trying to understand just how platforms actually feature and how these networks came into being, how they organize themselves, etc. And I found some interesting sort of combinations of how new and more traditional media are used to inform the public and also enable narrative continuity. So radio will be used in conjunction with WhatsApp groups and Twitter, etc., depending on the message, depending on the audience. And also just how the different functionalities of platform elements are harnessed in relation to target audiences. For example, Ndufuna Ukwazi formed an alliance with the Western Cape, which is the provincial area that we're based in, the Western Cape Property Owners Association. So these are the property owners, these are the people with the money. And the kind of tools that they use to harness support from the Western Cape Property Owners Association is quite different from what they were using to kind of communicate with others. So there's definitely a kind of choice element that has a lot to do with being quite strategic. And then also capturing the public imagination, and this is through the cans and in Ndufuna Ukwazi, using theatre, on-site theatre, online video and cartoons, a lot of creativity, a lot of imagination, on and off-site combinations of interactive workshops on the legal frameworks that inform housing and spatial planning, so an educational element. I mean, to me, the really interesting thing is around the capturing of everyday realities and stories, because to me, that's a kind of experiential data gathering that I think has really interesting implications for the way that we think about data and data-based urbanism. But again, just the centrality of normative values. I mean, when I interviewed people from Indefino Quasi, I said, well, you know, you guys get quite polarizing kind of in some of your talk. You know, some of your tweets make me feel uncomfortable as a, you know, another white middle class sort of person living in a South African city. And I remember one of the interviewers saying, well, that's the intention, is we intentionally cheeky. We intentionally try and kind of destabilize people like you. You know, we intentionally want to kind of drag you out of your comfort zone. And we love using social media to do that. And yeah, I mean, another thing that comes up for me, especially as a planner, is the kind of engagement of qualities of place. There's a very direct engagement with place, you know, very direct engagement with, you know, Mrs. So-and-so from Woodstock, which is an area of gentrification in Cape Town, has lived here for 20 years, she's shopped at this shop, she's, you know, there's a kind of storytelling element that brings the day-to-day into it. And yeah, just this kind of hybrid combinations, but also the physical impacts. The fact is there's physical impacts, community gardens, cloud kitchens, distribution of food tokens, occupation of vacant public buildings. And also policy shift, the court action, and of course, and the city of Cape Town has re-looked at its inclusionary housing policy. So it's kind of working. But I guess it brings me down to this notion of cyborg activism and why I'm so attracted to the idea. And by now, no doubt you've realized that I take this kind of very sort of, I guess, like a kind of relational approach to this work. I mean, I was very attracted to Kellogg's work in Cuba. And he talks about sort of alternative discursive spaces that are created through blogging in this case. And these kind of subversive narratives that are generated and distributed, circulated rather, where kind of social networks become cyborg entities, assemblages of heterogeneous techno-social elements with porous boundaries and radical political motivations. And I think it really accurately reflects what I'm seeing here, actually. I mean, Assenbaum writes about, you know, the private pervades public spaces, the modern separation of rationality, objectivity, and cool-headed politics on the one hand, and emotion, passion, and effect on the other is reconfigured. And I've seen this over and over again in some of the urban politics in Cape Town in particular. Some of you might have heard that Colin McFarlane has written about this, the so-called poo politics around sanitation in townships in Cape Town, and around the way that the whole notion of poo was used as a strategy to kind of get people's attention. And a colleague of mine from Stellenbosch University, an anthropologist, writes about the slow activism of some of these movements, how they kind of slowly but surely kind of build support through their actions. So there is a kind of cool-headed politics on the one hand, and then there's the kind of use of emotion and display of emotion on the other to win hearts and minds. And I sort of go back to Donna Haraway. I go back to this kind of hybrid of machine and organism, using fiction, social reality lived, is lived social relations, and then these world-changing fictions, actually, that I'm seeing kind of playing itself out in the various narratives that I've documented. So what are these qualities of cyborg activism then, if I had to start exploring what that is, and bearing in mind I'm playing with this still? I mean, I do think it's interesting how it sort of moves us from the personal, the emotional, to the immediately spatial, the physical realm, whilst engaging with the broader personal policy realm as well. There seems to be a scalar sort of mobility that's enabled through this work, which is potentially perhaps powerful. And then this blurring of boundaries between subjective and objective, experiential and factual, cultural, and the policy environment, not always a good thing, but I think something to look out for. This kind of experiential engagement and alliance building, winning hearts and minds. And then I think in the South African context, it's quite poignant just to think about legacy. I mean, a lot of these folks that work in the cans, for example, are old activists from years gone by who've worked in street committees and organizational abilities are just insane. And they sort of have become involved in this kind of politics as well. And apparently with no little amount of conflict. Almost there. And then, yeah, I think unraveling these assemblages of tech, community action, and physical expression within their place-based context provides a useful reminder of the contingency of technological innovation at these kind of local scales. Second last slide. So to me, the question really is, maybe a question is, are they truly situationally focused? I mean, can we do this kind of work in London? Can we sort of get a sense of, or do they represent epistemological and ontological shifts where the experiential and emotional dimensions of urban data can shift public discourse? Can we sort of take Maria Kaika's sort of point further, and can this become performative in a larger sense, and maybe even sort of start maybe the noir side of it? Can it start sort of blurring the boundaries between what counts as knowledge and truth? I mean, to me, I think the implications for my own research is really about how we analyze and how we define what we analyze. I mean, I think sort of seeing these collectives as sort of socio-technical assemblages, as associational infrastructures that include sort of identities and constructs, practices, and I think potentially, and I'm bringing citizenship into it now, and I think it's a can of worms actually, but that creates perhaps spaces for citizenship in the everyday. My feeling is that there's a lot to do there in relation to digital citizenship and the smart city, I guess. Thank you.